In the blistering heat of a Georgia summer, a pregnant widow stood on a splintered auction block, her dignity stripped for $1, until a broken soldier stepped forward with a price no one could match. The sun beat down on the red clay of the old Marshall plantation that July morning in 1882, its rays merciless, turning the air into a haze of dust and despair. The smell of tobacco and cotton hung heavy, clinging to the sweat-soaked collars of the crowd gathered in the clearing. They'd come for the auction, not for land, not for livestock, but for a woman and her child. Clara stood on a makeshift platform of warped pine and rusted nails, her bare feet stinging against the rough wood, her swollen belly straining the faded muslin of her dress. The once white ribbon in her sun-bleached blonde hair hung limp, its ends frayed like her hope. She clutched her son Henry's hand, his tiny fingers trembling in hers, his blonde curls plastered to his dirt-streaked forehead. At 5 years old, he barely reached her waist, his bare feet caked with the same red earth that stained her hem, a crumbling piece of cornbread clutched in his fist like a lifeline. The man beside them, her husband, though he'd long since stopped deserving the name, swayed on his heels, a bottle of cheap whiskey dangling from his hand. His shirt was stained with tobacco spit, his grin a jagged slash of yellowed teeth. "Step right up, folks," he slurred, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a dull blade. $1 for the set. A sturdy woman, cooks, cleans, and got another young'un on the way. Hell, might be twins for all I know. He laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed off the sagging barn nearby. The crowd shifted uneasily, their whispers rising like a swarm of bees. "Ain't right," an old farmer muttered, his straw hat pulled low. "Sellin' a woman like she's a mule," but another voice, sharp and bitter, cut back. "She's his to sell, ain't she? No law around here to stop it." Clara didn't flinch. Her pale blue eyes, the color of a sky after rain, stared straight ahead, past the jeering faces, past the men who spat at the ground and the women who turned away in shame. She didn't cry, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But her grip on Henry tightened as the crowd's taunts grew louder. $1's too much for a used-up widow." A man shouted, his laughter joined by others. "Look at her, already got one brat and another comin'." Henry's small frame shook, his big blue eyes darting up to his mother, searching for safety she couldn't promise. Then a voice broke through the chaos, small but fierce. "This ain't Christian." A young girl, no older than 18, pushed to the front, her calico dress a faded blue, a straw hat with dried flowers trembling on her head. Eliza, the miller's daughter, clenched her fists, her brown eyes blazing. "Y'all ought to be ashamed." But the crowd drowned her out with cheers, a bottle shattering at her feet, forcing her to stumble back. Clara's gaze flickered to the girl for a moment, a silent gratitude passing between them before returning to the horizon. She'd seen worse than this. She could bear it, but someone else couldn't. At the edge of the clearing, a man stood, apart from the crowd, his shadow long against the crimson earth. Nathaniel was tall but lean, his frame carrying the weight of years he hadn't lived. 35, though the silver streaking his black hair made him look older. His gray eyes, the color of a gathering storm, watched the scene with a stillness that unnerved those who noticed him. His linen shirt was patched but clean, his black trousers faded, a straw hat pulled low over his brow. Around his neck hung a bronze military medal on a leather cord, a relic from his father's days in the Confederate Army, the only piece of his past he hadn't buried. He'd come to the plantation to buy seed, not a family. But when Clara's eyes met his, just a fleeting second, a spark of defiance amid her despair, he felt something crack open inside him, a wound he'd thought long sealed. The drunkard shoved Clara forward, her bare feet catching on a splinter, a bead of blood blooming against the wood. "Who'll take her?" he bellowed. $1 and she's yours to name." The crowd's laughter swelled, a cruel chorus, but Nathaniel moved. His boots crunched against the clay as he stepped forward, the metal at his throat glinting in the sunlight. The drunkard squinted at him, sneering. "What's your bid, stranger?" Nathaniel's voice was low, steady, the kind of quiet that silenced a room. "I'll take her, the woman and the boy." The crowd hushed, the air thick with tension. The drunkard laughed a mocking bark. $1 then, show me your coin. Nathaniel reached for the metal, his fingers tracing the worn bronze, the last tether to a father he'd buried a decade ago. This is what I have, he said, his voice unwavering, as he held it out like an offering. But would it be enough to buy their freedom or their future? The wagon creaked under the weight of unspoken words as it rolled away from the Marshall plantation, the dust of that shameful auction still clinging to their skin. Clara sat in the back, her bare feet dangling off the edge, her swollen belly heavy against her faded muslin dress. The white ribbon in her sun-bleached blonde hair fluttered weakly in the humid breeze, its frayed ends a quiet testament to all she'd lost. Henry clung to her side, his small frame trembling, his blonde curls matted with sweat and red clay. He clutched the crumbling piece of cornbread in his fist, his big blue eyes darting nervously between his mother and the man at the reins. Nathaniel drove in silence, his straw hat pulled low, the bronze military medal at his throat catching the last rays of a blood-red sunset. His gray eyes, stormy and unreadable, stayed fixed on the horizon, as if the road ahead could erase the echoes of the crowd's jeers still ringing in their ears. The path wound through endless fields of cotton, the white bowls glowing like ghosts in the fading light, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the earth. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the faint, bitter scent of tobacco carried on the wind. Clara's hands tightened around Henry, her pale blue eyes scanning the fields for threats she'd long learned to expect. She didn't trust this quiet man. Not yet. Men didn't risk their father's legacy for a woman like her without wanting something in return. But Nathaniel didn't turn, didn't speak, his broad shoulders steady as the wagon rocked over, ruts in the clay. Beside him, on the driver's seat, sat a small wooden box, its lid carved with a delicate image of a woman holding a child, a relic of a life he'd buried, though Clara didn't know it yet. They stopped at the edge of a sagging oak grove, the trees draped in Spanish moss that swayed like mourning veils. Nathaniel climbed down, his boots stirring the dust, and offered a hand to Henry. The boy hesitated, glancing at Clara, but she nodded, her jaw tight. Henry reached out, his small hand dwarfed in Nathaniel's calloused palm, and for a moment, the air softened. "Got any of that cornbread left?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low, almost gentle. Henry blinked, then held out the crumbling piece, a shy offering. Nathaniel took it, broke off a small bite, and handed the rest back, a silent pact forged in the twilight. Clara watched them, her heart a tangle of fear and something she couldn't name. She slid off the wagon, her bare feet sinking into the warm earth, but a sharp pain sliced through her abdomen, sudden and fierce. She gasped, one hand clutching her belly, the other gripping the wagon's edge. Nathaniel turned at the sound, his gray eyes narrowing with concern. "You all right?" he asked, stepping closer but not too close, his hands hovering like he wasn't sure what to do with them. "Just a twinge," Clara lied, her voice steady despite the ache. "It'll pass." But her pale blue eyes betrayed her, shimmering, with a fear she couldn't hide, not from him. He nodded, though he didn't look convinced, and turned to unhitch the horse. The cicada's song grew louder as the last light bled from the sky, casting the grove in shades of indigo and shadow. Clara sat on a fallen log, Henry curled against her, his breathing soft but uneven. She looked at Nathaniel, his silhouette, sharp against the darkening fields, and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why'd you do it? Back there at the auction?" He didn't turn, just kept working, his hands steady on the reins. "Couldn't leave you standing there," he said, his voice rough but honest. "Not after all you'd been through." Her breath caught, a flicker of warmth battling the ice in her chest. But what had he been through to see her pain so clearly? The cabin sat at the edge of the oak grove like a forgotten prayer, its weathered pine walls silvered by the moonlight filtering through the Spanish moss. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and pine sap, a single oil lamp casting trembling shadows across the floor. Clara stood near the door, her bare feet tracing the grooves of the worn planks, her faded muslin dress clinging to her skin in the humid Georgia night. The ribbon in her sun-bleached blonde hair had come loose, trailing down her shoulder like a whisper of the life she'd left behind. Henry sat cross-legged on a threadbare quilt near the stove, his small hands turning a chipped glass orb he'd found on a shelf. A relic of Nathaniel's past, its swirling blue center catching the lamplight like a trapped storm. The boy's blue eyes sparkled with quiet wonder, a rare moment of peace after the day's horrors. Clara's pale blue gaze lingered on her son, her heart a storm of relief and fear, but her thoughts were interrupted by a soft scraping sound. Nathaniel sat at a small table in the corner, his broad shoulders hunched, a knife in his calloused hand as he carved a piece of cedar into the shape of a sparrow. His black hair, streaked with silver, fell across his brow, and his gray eyes, stormy as the clouds gathering outside, focused on the wood with a tenderness that made Clara's chest ache. He hadn't spoken since they'd arrived. Not since, he'd murmured, "Y'all can rest here tonight," his voice rough but steady. She watched him, her fingers brushing a cracked ivory comb tucked in her pocket, the only thing her mother had left her. A fragile tether to a time before shame. The silence stretched, heavy as the humid air until Clara spoke, her voice low, almost lost in the hum of crickets outside. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her words sharp with the edge of suspicion. "Take us in, you don't even know us." Nathaniel didn't look up, his knife pausing mid-stroke. "Didn't feel right to leave you out there," he said, his tone as steady as the rhythm of his carving. "Not after what I saw." Her breath caught and she took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the floor. "What did you see?" she asked, softer now, her blue eyes searching his face. He set the sparrow down, its wings half-formed, and finally met her gaze. "I saw a woman who'd been through hell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And a boy who deserved better." Clara's throat tightened, her fingers curling around the comb in her pocket. She wanted to argue, to push him away, but the weight of his words cracked something inside her. "I lost a child once," she blurted, her voice breaking like glass. "Before Henry, my husband, he came home drunk one night, slammed a chair, so hard I fell. I bled for days. He said it was my fault, said I wasn't strong enough." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her jaw tight. Nathaniel's hands stilled, the knife resting against the table. "I lost my family, too," he said after a long silence, his gray eyes distant as if seeing a ghost. "My wife and daughter 3 years back. Yellow fever took 'em both in a week. I came home to an empty house, nothing but their shawls on the bed." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, and she turned away, her shoulders trembling. Outside, a sudden rain began to fall, the drops drumming against the roof like a mournful hymn. Henry looked up from his glass orb, his small voice cutting through the tension. "Mama, don't cry," he whispered, clutching the orb tighter. Nathaniel stood, his chair scraping softly, and crossed the room to kneel beside the boy. "Your Mama's strong, Henry," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Stronger than anyone I've known." Clara turned back, her tear-streaked face catching the lamplight, and for the first time, she saw something in Nathaniel's eyes that wasn't pity, it was understanding. But what other ghosts lingered in this cabin, waiting to be unearthed? The days at the Oak Grove cabin unfolded like the slow unfurling of a cotton boll, tentative and fragile under the unrelenting Georgia sun. By morning, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, a thin veil of mist clinging to the sagging branches outside, softening the harsh edges of the world Clara had known too well. Inside, the cabin hummed with a quiet rhythm, each small act a thread weaving them closer, though none dared name it. Clara sat by the window, her bare feet tucked beneath her, the faded muslin of her dress pooling around her like a wilted flower. She worked a needle through a torn shirt of Henry's, her fingers steady despite the ache in her swollen belly, the white ribbon in her sun-bleached blonde hair catching the golden light that slipped through the moss-draped oaks. Her pale blue eyes flicked to her son, a flicker of warmth breaking through her guarded gaze. Henry knelt on the floor, his small hands tracing the swirls of the glass orb he'd claimed as his treasure, his blonde curls glowing in the morning light. He hummed a tune, a folk song Clara's mother had sung long ago, about a river that never stopped running, its melody as soft as the mist outside. The sound drew Nathaniel's attention from the porch, where he sat whittling a small, wooden horse, its mane carved with careful precision, his gray eyes, stormy as the clouds that lingered on the horizon, softened as he watched the boy, the bronze metal at his throat glinting with each careful stroke of his knife. He stood, his boots scuffing the weathered boards, and stepped inside, holding the horse out to Henry. "Thought you might like this," he said, his voice low, the kind of gentle that felt like a promise. Henry's blue eyes widened, a shy smile breaking across his face as he took the toy, clutching it to his chest like it was worth more than gold. Clara's needle paused, her breath catching at the sight. She wanted to thank him, to say something, but the words stuck in her throat, tangled with the fear that had rooted deep inside her. What if this kindness was a trap, a softness that would leave her defenseless? She set the shirt aside, her hands trembling, and stood, one hand bracing her belly as she moved to the door. The mist had thickened, cloaking the grove in a ghostly shroud, and the air felt heavier, pressing against her chest. A sharp pain lanced through her, sudden and fierce, and she gasped, clutching the doorframe, her knuckles whitening. Nathaniel was at her side in an instant, his hand hovering near her elbow, not touching but close enough to steady her. "Easy, now," he murmured, his gray eyes searching hers. "You need to sit?" She shook her head, her jaw tight, but the pain lingered, a warning of what was to come. "I can't let myself get too comfortable here," she whispered, her voice raw, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I've been broken before, I can't let it happen again." Nathaniel's hand dropped, but his gaze held hers, steady as the oaks outside. "Ain't no one breaking you here," he said, his voice firm but soft. "Not while I'm around." The mist swirled around them, the cabin glowing faintly in the haze, and for the first time Clara felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous, fragile thing. But how long could such hope survive the shadows of her past? The Georgia sun hung low in the sky, its golden light filtering through the ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows over the clearing where Clara stood, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth. She'd shed her tattered apron, her muslin dress, clinging to her swollen frame, the white ribbon in her sun-bleached blonde hair catching the breeze like a quiet surrender. Beside her, Henry clutched his wooden horse, his blonde curls glowing in the sunlight, his blue eyes wide with a mix of wonder and fear. Nathaniel stood before them, his linen shirt crisp despite the heat, the bronze military medal at his throat, glinting with each careful breath. In his hands he held a handkerchief embroidered with his mother's initials, a faded keepsake, the only witness to the vow he was about to make. The air buzzed with the hum of cicadas and the distant trill of a mockingbird, but a heavier weight pressed down on them all. A letter from town delivered that morning, its words a cold threat. Clara's former husband had claimed her as stolen property, demanding Henry's return under the guise of law. Clara's pale blue eyes flickered with dread, her fingers tightening around Henry's small hand. But Nathaniel had made a decision, before the ink on that letter had dried. "We'll make it right," he'd said, his voice steady as the oaks around them. Now, beneath the sprawling branches of the oldest tree, he knelt before her, the handkerchief draped over his palm like a promise. "I ain't got much to give," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers, stormy, yet unwavering. "But I got my name, and it's yours if you'll have it. Marry me, Clara. Not just to keep Henry safe, but because I can't imagine this cabin without y'all in it." Her breath caught, a tear slipping down her cheek, but before she could answer, a sharp pain sliced through her belly, fierce and unyielding. She gasped, doubling over, her free hand clutching her side as the world tilted. Nathaniel caught her elbow, his touch gentle but firm, his voice low and urgent. "Clara, you all right?" She nodded through gritted teeth, the pain subsiding, but her eyes shimmered with fear, not just for the child within her, but for the family she'd dared to hope for. "I'll marry you," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. and Henry's small voice broke through the tension, bright as the sunlight. "Does that mean you're my pa now?" he asked, clutching the wooden horse tighter. Nathaniel turned to the boy, a rare smile softening his weathered face. "If you'll have me, son," he said, and Henry threw his arms around him, the word pa echoing like a hymn in the humid air. They spoke their vows beneath the oak, no preacher, no crowd. Just the mockingbird as their witness and Nathaniel's handkerchief tying their hands together in a knot as old as the land itself. Clara wept softly, not from sorrow, but from the weight of a safety she hadn't known she could feel. But as they turned back toward the cabin, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon, the faint clatter of hooves breaking the stillness. The law was coming faster than they'd expected, and Clara's hand tightened on Nathaniel's, her blue eyes searching his for strength. Could their new bond withstand the storm riding toward them, and the life waiting to be born? The rain fell soft that night, a gentle patter against the cabin's tin roof as if the Georgia sky itself was holding its breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and kerosene, the flickering light of an oil lamp casting golden shadows across the walls. Clara lay on the narrow cot, her muslin dress soaked with sweat, her sun-bleached blonde hair plastered to her forehead. Her pale blue eyes were wide with pain, her hands gripping the edges of a faded quilt as another contraction tore through her. Nathaniel knelt beside her, his gray eyes steady, his voice a low murmur of encouragement. "You're doing fine, Clara," he said, his calloused hand resting near hers, not touching, just close enough to offer strength. Henry sat in the corner, his small frame curled around his wooden horse, his blue eyes darting nervously to his mother, a string of wooden beads, Clara's mother's rosary, dangling from his fingers as he whispered a prayer he barely understood. The labor stretched into the early hours, each cry from Clara a raw, primal sound that echoed through the cabin, mingling with the rain's soft rhythm. Nathaniel stayed by her side, fetching water, wiping her brow, his movements calm despite the storm in his chest. When the baby's first cry broke through, a sharp, trembling wail like a mockingbird's song, Clara's tears fell freely, not from pain, but from a love so fierce it hurt. Nathaniel lifted the tiny girl, her skin pink and wrinkled, and wrapped her in his mother's embroidered handkerchief, the same one that had bound their vows. "She's perfect," he whispered, handing her to Clara, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Clara cradled her daughter, naming her Grace after the hope she'd thought she'd lost, her blue eyes meeting Nathaniel's in a silent promise. Henry crept closer, his small hand brushing his sister's cheek, a shy smile breaking across his face. "I'm a brother now, Pa," he said, and Nathaniel's heart cracked open, the word Pa a balm to wounds he'd carried too long. But peace was short-lived. At dawn, as the rain gave way to a hazy sunrise, two men in dust-streaked coats arrived, their boots heavy on the porch. One held a crumpled letter, the other a cold stare, their voices sharp as they demanded Henry and the newborn, claiming Clara's former husband had rights under Georgia law. Nathaniel stepped forward, his broad frame filling the doorway, the bronze medal at his throat glinting in the early light. "This is my family," he said, his voice low but unyielding, a quiet storm of its own. "Y'all take one step closer, and you'll answer to more than your paper." The men hesitated, the truth in his gray eyes heavier than their orders, and turned back, their shadows fading into the mist. The days that followed were a quiet rebirth. Grace grew strong, her cries filling the cabin with life. Henry doted on her, singing the river folk song his mother had taught him, his wooden horse now a gift for his sister. Clara moved slower, her body healing, but her spirit brighter, the rosary now a symbol of the family she'd fought for. Nathaniel carved a small cradle, his hands steady with purpose, and one morning they planted a sycamore sapling beside the cabin, its roots a promise of permanence. As they stood together, the golden light of a Georgia spring washing over them, Clara leaned into Nathaniel, her hand finding his. "I never thought I'd be whole again," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, soft and sure. You always were, he said. I just helped you see it. In the years after the Civil War, Georgia in 1882 was a land of upheaval, where women like Clara often faced unimaginable hardship, sold, abandoned, or erased by a society rebuilding itself on fragile ground. Yet their stories, like this one, remind us of the resilience that bloomed in the cracks, the families forged not by blood, but by mercy. If this tale of love and survival touched your heart, give us a like, hit that subscribe button, and share. Your thoughts below. What would you plant to mark a new beginning? Let's keep these stories alive together.